Would everyone like to take a seat? We'll be starting in 2 minutes. Thank you, everyone, for coming and for celebrating the opening of Ex-Machina. We're very lucky today to have these panelists with us discussing collecting and creating generative art. To my right, we have Georg back, who is an advisor, curator, and also the curator of Ex-Machina. We also have Anna Ridler, an artist who focuses on data sets. Would you say is the main focus on GANs? We also have Douglas Dodds, who's the senior or former senior curator at the V&A. And we also have Sophia Garcia, who is a dealer, curator, and also the founder of ArtX Code. So to start the talk, I thought the best thing to do would be to ask each of you, what is generative art to you, and how would you define it?
It is first, or?
I agree with George.
I'm a gentleman. I start. Well, generative art is actually based on generative aesthetics, which was defined in the 60s by Max Benzer. He was a German philosopher teaching at Stuttgart. Two of his pupils were Georg and Frieder Nake, who became like the first artists using generative methods. And he defined generative aesthetics as a form of art that is automated by a set of rules that the artist is defining by creating an algorithm. And in the beginning, they were using even like analog methods to create this kind of art. and slowly it moved into computing systems. So they had machines that were using these algorithms to create art. Next, please.
Go ahead.
So kind of like, I think of it very similarly. It's kind of like a set of rules that can then lead to complexity. So I think about how I work. I work a lot with artificial intelligence. I work a lot with machine learning. I also kind of do a lot of work with data sets, which is the information that you put into kind of the algorithm that then generates something. And in each of the, so I'm kind of working in multiple different ways when I'm making generative art, kind of creating a data set, creating an algorithm, then kind of working with the output. And in each of those processes, I'm following different rules, but I'm also allowing kind of like something to kind of come out of that. I think for me, there's this very strong parallel when I work kind of with machines and with algorithms to kind of create this generative art with working with nature. I think there's something kind of very similar when you're kind of like planning and plotting and kind of thinking about how something will turn out and then allowing something else to then act on it and come out. So I often kind of think of it and compare it to gardening, when you're kind of, you have an idea of what you're going to have, but you can never tell exactly what's going to flourish, exactly what's going to flower, exactly what's going to come out. And there's this tension, I think, when you work with it between kind of what you plan and how much you can plan and how much you can kind of anticipate and then what actually comes out. And so there's this tension between kind of like these simple rules and this inherent complexity that kind of like weave together when you're working with it.
Yeah, I would agree, actually. I also think of it as a set of rules within which the artist operates, and there's an element of chance in what comes out, and there's an element of control in what goes into it. So again, I like your analogy to the sort of walled garden. You're within this space, and things happen within this space, and sometimes you get a few weeds, and you kind of pull up the weeds and throw them away. But in among that, there's all the beautiful things that come out of it as well. So yeah, for me, it's essentially a set of rules that the artist operates within, and we tend to think of it as being perhaps a computer program that an artist uses, but it could be something else entirely. You know, systems art generally, more broadly, is a set of rules, and you might just have a series of things that you do in order to generate the artworks. And generative art in the computer-generated sense is an example of that.
Yeah, I'll just follow up on that with same premise. It is a system-based approach to creating art, and so the artist must create the system, and there is this element of surprise, what is going to come out of that. But you know, it is up to the artist to make that set of rules very explicit, and there's a collaboration happening there with the machine and you know, what it can compute. But I think we look at generative art, and I think you were just alluding to this now too, that generative art is more of an umbrella term, and I think what we're focusing on specifically is computer-generated art right now. And so in the show, you'll see algorithmic art, so system-based approach, but using computer-generated algorithm, computer programming, AI, artificial intelligence, data sets, like with Anna's work. And so it is this rather this large umbrella term that can be used to describe multiple ways of creation. But at the end, must be this sense of autonomy in the system that's being produced by the artist.
And Sophia, you're known for your work with generative artists like Matt Delorier and Dmitry Cherniak. I wanted to ask, how do you pick your artists? Because you clearly have quite a good eye. How do you pick them, and what do you look for?
Well, it's important to know that I do have a background in computer science and engineering, so and in the arts. So there has to be a conversation between their technical skill and their artistic ability, their understanding of color, composition. It's not enough to just have great technical skill. There really needs to be, unfortunately, you know, there really does have to be this next level, and their ability to tell you who they are with their artwork, I think, is really important. Yeah, there's much more to it, but you know, I think that's a good way of phrasing it.
And then I'd also go to Georg. We've kind of been working together for about 8 months to put the show together. Do you want to talk a bit about how you picked some of the works in the show?
Well, first of all, we had the idea to do a show where we also present, like for the first time, these pioneers of computer art. And yeah, I think we got a nice selection together. I mean, for me, it was important to have like major pieces. Like I was really fighting with the artists to get those pieces. It was not that easy because they don't like to. Some of them just want to keep them and put them together into a foundation or donate them to museums. And so I had to convince them that it's better to go into the market. But I think the concept of the show is actually it's based. I mean the title Ex-Machina is actually a title that comes from the history of computer art. There has been an essay by Abraham Moll, I think in the 60s, which was called Ex-Machina, and there was also an exhibition that Herbert Franke, one of the earliest pioneers of computer art, was planning in the 70s in Vienna at the Künstlerhaus. And so they put together a wonderful show, but at the end it didn't happen because they didn't have the finances. And so suddenly somebody contacted him from Linz and said, okay, let's bring this show to Linz. And well, it was more than just a show, it was kind of like a festival. And that's how Ars Electronica was founded. So it was quite a moment, and I thought it would be a nice title for a show and to do something in the sense of this idea that Franke had in his time, and put together like a nice overview of the most talented artists of our time, and contextualize them with some of the pioneers of computer art. So we have works by Herbert Franke, Frida Nake, Georg Nees, Vera Molnar, some of the pioneers of generative photography. The founder of generative photography was Gottfried Jäger, wonderful pieces by Hein Grafenhorst. We have some major artists from the New Tendencies movement, Tom Mikulic, Vladimir Bonacic, and then we have also a few interesting artists from the net art movement like Ubermorgen and Vuk Kosic. So yeah, it's a nice overview. I mean, obviously, if you want to be like, we could probably add another 50 artists, right? We were trying, but space is limited, and I think we also picked a few of the contemporary artists that are quite relevant.
And Douglas, you're known for kind of helping build the V&A's. I guess it's one of the world's largest kind of collections of generative art, especially early art. How did that come about, and how did you do that?
Well, it wasn't just me, but in fact, I can't claim credit at all for the first works that came into the V&A collection. As many of you in this room, I'm sure, will know that digital art didn't just start 10 or 15 years ago. It started much, much earlier. And depending on where you want to go back to, you can go back to the 1960s. You can arguably go back even earlier than that. But there was this iconic exhibition held in London in 1968 called Cybernetic Serendipity. Great title, great exhibition. But it was one of several that took place that year in different places. So there was a kind of zeitgeist about it. Amazingly, the V&A collected its first computer-generated images as a result of that show. So in 1969, the museum acquired a set of 7 prints that were published in conjunction with the cybernetic exhibition at the ICA. Has to be said, though, that the curators at the time, some of them weren't that keen on them. And there was a big argument in the museum. I could see the official correspondence about it, you know, saying, why on earth would anybody want to collect this computer-generated stuff? It's not art. But eventually they did. So essentially the V&A, for example, started collecting computer-generated works more than 50 years ago. And there are very few museums, I think, that could say that. Having said that, not a lot happened for quite a few years afterwards. We collected a few works by Manfred Moore, Vera Molnar slipped in, and one or two others, but basically not a lot happened for a few decades. And then I basically struck lucky because I was in a complicated merger of different departments in the museum, and I kind of looked around and I thought, they're doing photography, and they're doing paintings, and they're doing prints. There's nobody seems to be doing digital stuff. So it seemed to me that it was obvious that we were in a new revolution and that museums ought to really be collecting that kind of thing. So basically, I just went for it at a time when there were very few other institutions that were doing it. A couple in Germany, but not many other ones. So I was able to get to know a lot of the artists long before the current interest in digital art took off. And got to know one or two major collectors as well. And people started giving things to the V&A because they were desperate to have some sort of public recognition of it at a time when, you know, basically nobody was very interested in it. So that's how it started, with the acquisition of two major collections. One from a private collector called Patrick Prince, as in Patricia, a woman, incidentally, who was collecting digital art quite a long time ago. And the other was the archives of an organization called the Computer Arts Society, CAS, that was founded as a result of the cybernetic serendipity exhibition. So suddenly the V&A had 500 or 600 artworks from those two sources alone, and it basically grew from there.
Wonderful. And Anna, I guess we've spoken a lot about very tangible artworks, which are somewhat easier to collect, but of course you work with data, AI and GANs, which is notoriously hard to control. How do you work with collectors to ensure that your work can be collected and conserved, and how do you do that? What's the process?
So I think it depends on what project I'm kind of working on, what the end result is. Because I think for me, one of the interesting things about working in this way, working kind of in the lineage of this generative art, is that it can be incredibly conceptual. So sometimes kind of the output, so I've started to do kind of some NFT-driven work. Sometimes kind of the work is the smart contract itself, and it's kind of highly conceptual. It just, you know, it sits on the blockchain and that's it. And then other times the work can be a lot more tangible. It can be a kind of printed data set, so it can be photographs, thousands of photographs, which are all hand labeled, or it can be a moving image piece. And that's why I think it's very interesting, kind of this space, because it's, as kind of like we talked a little bit before, it's not one thing, it's this umbrella term that can kind of include kind of, you know, moving image, it can include prints, it can include kind of code, it can include, you know, photography. And I think what makes it, for me, kind of like a really rich way of working is that you can kind of use these different outputs or these different parts of the process to kind of like echo or bring out kind of like the concept that you're working on. So for me, kind of, it's important that the collectors, or when I'm kind of selling work, that collectors kind of understand how all of these pieces fit together, and how kind of like a single project can actually have like multiple different outcomes, and some of which are tangible and very kind of sellable, and others are less tangible and more esoteric, I suppose.
Yeah, and then I guess the question for all of you, because you've kind of been around before the boom of NFTs you've seen in the last kind of year and a half or 2 years, but do you find that your work is being, I guess for you, Anna, collected by traditional collectors or crypto collectors, I guess to everyone else? What does the split look like? What's the engagement between those kind of traditional historic collectors and those maybe newer collectors that might be crypto native?
It's a real spread. Like it really kind of depends. Like I have kind of institutional collectors and I have crypto collectors, and it's all over the place. And again, that's it just seems kind of like really exciting because, you know, it's everything from kind of works through to kind of process pieces. It's wide open at the moment.
And I guess, Sophia, I know you work with a split of both crypto and traditional. Yeah, how does that work for you, and what does it look like day to day?
Well, I think earlier when crypto obviously started to kick off, there's the archetypal crypto collector who really came in more for financial reasons for the most part. I was talking about this earlier. There's this ongoing saying, it's came for the flip, stayed for the art, that a lot of collectors have started to say. And so you find them starting to get into a little bit more art history, trying to figure out what is this that I'm looking at, and where does it stand at this moment, especially since they've collected 3,000 artworks and they need to figure out, does this mean anything? And then when it comes to traditional art collectors, I think most of them have an interest in the conversations between human expression and technology, but for the most part, there is a lot of education and conversations that have to happen around what is generative art on the blockchain. It's especially now in this like crypto space, and when we look at NFTs, when we look at generative art, I think they work very well together, and they've really helped both sides of the coin grow and into something we would have never expected. So you look at some of the earliest examples of NFTs, and they are generative artworks. CryptoPunks, Quantum by Kevin McCoy. These are generative artworks, and then the autoglyphs, which, if you aren't familiar, it's one of the first examples of this idea of on-chain generative art. So the code itself is part of, I guess, your acquisition. So beforehand, there's some works here in the auction where you acquire the work, but you also acquire a printout of the code that produced it. And now, as a collector, you can acquire this work online. The code is part of that entire process, and so you are now acquiring the performative act of it running. You're not looking at a print or this other output or a video representation of it. It is that performance, and I think that's a huge indicator there. It's just, this is really cool. And so getting that message across to collectors is always really fun, especially in the traditional art world. So.
Great, and I guess, George, playing on from that, why did you see it as so important to include kind of more contemporary on-chain works and contextualize them with almost 60, 70 years of photography, prints, sculpture? Why was that a conscious choice?
Well, I think a lot of ideas have been around for many decades that you see again. They're kind of like recreated, but I think nowadays you have much better technology, much better screens, ways to display art. So I think it's quite spectacular. I mean, if you look at the works like Rafik Anadol, for example, I mean, AI in the early days was very simple, like Harold Cohen did works of AI in the 80s. And I think if you compare it to what's happening now, this is just like almost like a renaissance of digital. Yeah, I mean, digital art is almost something like a renaissance because, yeah, it's I mean, first of all, I think this whole PFP thing that happened in the last few years, that is so so amazing how it just changes like everything, like our whole entertainment industry, the whole society. I mean, you can reinvent marketing, etc., with PFPs. I always like to kind of compare this with Joseph Beuys' vision, to change society, to create this soziale Plastik, as he said in German. It's called social plastic or something in English. So basically that people become co-creators. It's basically the artists just leaves a lot of the art to the society to be finished, So I think this whole NFT movement has a lot of, connections to art history, I think. Whether it's the situationists in the 60s or Dadaism, you find so many kind of interesting connections to art history. And I think, you have to see it in that way. I think, I think it's always interesting to see these contexts. And in this show, of course, we have the context of computer art, but there could be other contexts found in NFTs and in digital art, I think.
Great. I'm conscious that we started a little bit over, and I wanted to give everyone time for questions. So I think we'll stop there and open up the floor to any questions if anyone has any. Mimi, go for it.
I never ask questions, but I don't know why. Georg, you inspired me. So I have a question for Douglas. You said you had a communication in VNA in the 60s when they're like, why are you? I assume it wasn't on emails. Were there letters?
It was written out on paper. It was written out on paper. The museum at the time had a sort of standard process that went through to acquire each artwork. And of course, there was always money involved as well. So it would come from somebody's budget. So people would actually care to that extent about it as well. But essentially, there's this official form where they're passing the buck from one department to another until eventually the artworks ended up in the wonderfully named circulation department, which was a quite sort of subversive bit of the museum at the time, where everything went that didn't fit into the other categories of the other curatorial departments. But, you know, it's very easy to look back on it now and think, well, it was obvious, wasn't it, that they needed to get it. But I spent my entire career thinking that, you know, somebody in 30 years' time is going to look at this and laugh at me if I say, don't go with that, you know, and you don't go the thing that you obviously should be collecting. Yeah, like full marks for the people at the time that they did actually collect it.
Do you think VNA would ever acquire any PFP project?
What, sorry?
Any PFP?
Possibly. I couldn't speak for the V&A now because I don't work there anymore, but I know my former colleagues are actively looking at that sort of thing now. One of the very last things I did before I left was to transfer a certificate for an artwork that we just acquired to somebody else in the museum, because it was basically the museum's artwork, not mine personally. So, you know, the museum is already in that sort of space, and there are several others that I know of that are as well.
Thank you.
Great. Does anyone else have a question? At the back. I see two people. I'll run
out. It is a question for you, Benji. I was just going to ask you a little bit about what it's like to be an auction house now, and thinking about how DAOs are substantial parts of the kind of collector community. And I also just wanted to say thank you very much for George for talking about Joseph Beuys and PFPs in the same sentence. Never thought that would happen.
Yeah, I think in terms of DAOs, it's fascinating because they have a lot of buying power, firstly, but also it's a brand new model for collecting. So traditionally, collectors have been quite fragmented, and whilst you might have kind of institutional collections or people bringing collections together via institutions, it's nice that you can have a way where you don't need to trust each other. You can bring collections together. You can show them. You can, like Punk 6529 have built that enormous kind of plaza museum. I think that's a great way for art to become more accessible, and I think it's also a great for people to share and interact with each other. From an auction house perspective, you know, in terms of being anonymous and that sort of thing, it can be a little bit tricky at times. But I think, you know, as they become more commonplace and, you know, become more integrated in kind of the traditional art world, it will become a lot more normal, and we'll see a lot more of them.
Thank you.
Just wanted to do a quick, if you don't know what a DAO is, it's just a group of people who have a shared treasury, and so they can collect artwork together. And I think there are interesting problems that arise with that, especially when there's a physical counterpart to that artwork. They don't really know what to do with that. Are they going to go all in and with their shared treasury that isn't really a legal, institution in any capacity to then split a a storage facility to hold that, and it adds all these interesting problems. What type of artwork they can collect and acquire, and then something that I'm very interested in is just this idea of the digital institution, because a lot of DAOs start saying the word museum, and what does it mean to actually take care of a digital native collection in a decentralized manner. So that's just food for thought more than anything.
Hi there. As the medium progresses, and a lot of the artwork is generated by live running code, but it can be hard to display that type of art in a gallery setting. What, I guess, are some things that the artists are doing and can suggest to other artists in helping to onboard galleries in kind of showing and displaying the code native art the way it should be displayed?
I guess part of that is always the context in which the artist wishes to show their work. So if they want to see it live, there are ways in which you do that, and you kind of have to get creative with the way you handle it, because you're going to want to hide some of the boxes that are involved with that. But there are some artists that are actually rather lax with it, and are okay with, maybe it's supposed to be a plotter. It's supposed to be produced as a plotter. That is the end result, or a hologram, or it's supposed to be a I'm forgetting the word. Oh my God. Projector. Like, it's a projection, And so it is really. It's an interesting moment now, because you can decide, there's so many different ways to present an artwork. You can print it, and it doesn't actually have to be signed by the artist, and it can just be a representation of the artwork that you see online. There's zero, any part of that actually has to go home with the collector who acquires it. So yeah, it is actually, it's a bit vague now, and it really becomes a conversation always with the artist and their intention and what they want to see. So there's no really one size fits all, other than chat with the artist.
How do you attribute value to an emerging artist or an emerging, I guess, artwork? Do you use the same standards you used to use once upon a time? Or do you have a new set of parameters where it's like you look behind the proverbial hood to look at, say, the code, or to look at like the development of the piece or the potential of the piece?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Understanding, and you can totally. Okay. The code, I think, is really important, but for the most part, you don't actually have to look at it and study it and kind of like judge, compare algorithms, even though there's a joke there with an older, with Frieder Nake, who actually says that we should. But it's really interesting, because a lot of these artists, especially in the NFT community, were hobbyists for the most part, and sharing their work online and just having a really good time exploring the ways in which they can express themselves with something that they were using pretty much for work. A lot of them were engineers by trade. So it's really, again, just like seeing their talent, I think, is really, really important, and something that is hard to do when you don't know what's going on behind the scenes. So tech has this tendency to kind of be this like omniscient, all-knowing thing. These things just exist on the internet, but it's actually it's a very, very human experience to write the code, produce it, and it's actually quite difficult. So once you understand how much goes into writing a sophisticated computer program that can produce X amount of artworks depending on their practice, because it could just be one, it could be 1,000 like we see now in the NFT space, that all have to stand on their own. There has to be a visual language involved. There's a technical skill that's necessary that is kind of easy to dismiss when you don't have the context of what's actually going on behind the scenes. So I think now in the future, we have this whole generation of kids who know how to code. They are learning it from a very young age. So I have faith that they'll also study the humanities and be able to also appreciate this art as, later on. But for now, it's just, I think, a small, rather relatively small group of people who are really just trying to champion it and give as much context as possible to the understanding of what's going on.
Sorry, did you mean value as in the...
I mean, you're looking at an artwork tomorrow, deciding if you want to
acquire
a
it, yeah,
collection, or if you want to invest time into the artists and learn more about them. Do you use the same old school methods you used before?
To an extent. I mean, some of the same criteria apply, to do with cultural significance, innovation, technical expertise, whether anybody is ever going to want to see it. There's no point in acquiring something if it's just going to disappear without trace. So, there's a whole range of things that typically public museums, public galleries take into account when they're acquiring things. And quite often, you have to make the case internally within the institution as to why you should be getting this one rather than that one. The trick, of course, is to try and do it ahead of the curve rather than behind the curve, because if you're doing it ahead of the curve, then things are coming into collections that are more affordable. And there's also a kind of ecosystem there, which everybody sort of is aware of, which is once you're in that sort of institutional space, it becomes easier then to, sell things to other people as well. So, that's basically how the art world, or at least the public museum side of the art world operates. But quite often people will go out and get things anyway. I mean, one of the things that always used to worry me about things was whether they would survive. Whether they would continue to be accessible, visible, if you like, for future generations. And sometimes, frankly, they wouldn't be. And, in a way, that would be okay, so long as you were conscious of that at the time when you acquired it. It was less okay if you acquired it and then it just fell over the following day. But again, one of the aspects of digital art generally is that people tend to be pushing the boundaries quite a lot all the time. That's where the interest is. It's not the stuff that was done yesterday and there's now basically a commercial program you can use to do it. It's what's going to happen tomorrow that they're interested in. And by definition, those things are slightly flakier, so they're not necessarily so easy to collect or even preserve in the longer term. And that's just a challenge that, people like us have, and collectors have as well, actually.
I think there's an interesting tension that happens right now, especially in like this crypto community, of wanting to reject the status quo, the academy, the art, the fine art world, and have their own way, but at the same time, so desperately wanting to be a part of it. And so they go about in their own way and reject what they think is how things should go. And I don't think anyone really expected the market side of it to explode as quickly as it did. I know that I didn't. So I thought that this was going to be decades in the making of us talking about the way in which artists were using software, especially in the later 2000s, especially utilizing social media and all that. So I think right now, especially, it's a tricky-ish time because you can isolate really fascinating artists who are doing so many cool things, but I don't even think they even thought that being acquired by an institution or even a traditional art collector was in their future, in the realm of possibility.
And net art was an example of that, where net artists deliberately attempted to subvert the traditional gallery system, and now they're coming back into the gallery system and back into the museums and so on.
I'll just end on saying there's also this parallel path, right, where like art was just a mechanism to get access to a community, and the art inherently had no value to a lot of people who are sort of engaging in this space today.
Yeah, is it very community-based, just sharing art, like, hey, look what I did. Like Instagram, 2015, 2014, everyone was just sharing what they were doing with processing. That's a programming language that a lot of artists use nowadays. And you would just check the hashtag and be like, cool, like, hey, like, I really love what you did. And now there's actually a really interesting trend where artists are no longer putting their artwork on Instagram. They're no longer putting it public because now they don't care, but like, they don't need your likes. They can just post it, they can mint it, and you can say, I like that, I'll buy it. There's no need to just give you this like. So yeah, it's been a fascinating change in just a few years.
Thank you. That's really interesting. I just had a question, maybe a little bit technical, around the kind of the code that's being used for some of the work that's being created. You mentioned that you're selling the code or printout of the code itself as part of the work. I just ask what exactly is being sold. I know you asked that slightly from the perspective of someone that I'm working with has created some of the code themselves, but actually incorporated other code from other places. And there's a claim being made by someone who created another element of the code that they actually have a claim for ownership of the artwork itself, or at least a partial ownership. So I just wondered what your perspective on that would be. And secondly, start with that person. It's fine.
I think it's fascinating, especially so. Actually, a great example of this is Christie's. They did their first auction. I'm forgetting what year, maybe 2017. It was their first time selling an AI artwork. It was by this collective, Obvious, and it made this record sale. And then all of a sudden, this outrage came. They had taken a model that had been trained by another artist who had put it online, this idea of open source. And there was this utopian view of open source code, putting everything out there for the open, but now there's money involved. And so I think, it gets a little dicey. People put their work out there, and this, again, sharing, wanting to learn. It is very much part of, decentralized learning, I think, is a big part of how a lot of these artists work, especially in the software space. It's complicated, and I think now with NFTs, there's a lot of just really highlighting, underlining the fact of use Creative Commons, use anything that can stay. What are the rights to this artwork? What is there? And so there are some places. Ferrophile is a marketplace, for example, that makes it very clear. They make it very explicit. What are the rights to the artist? What are the rights to the collectors? And I would love to see that happen more in this space, and just be very explicit about what you can and what you cannot do. And I think the same applies with code. When you put things on GitHub, make it very clear what can you do, what you can't do. There's some artists, in this space who say you can capitalize on this up to use it for commercial purposes up to $100,000. After that, call me. So that is a dialogue that I think is really important to have with artists and creators in general, sharing their stuff online, because it starts off as a good, but then money, muddles that up a little bit.
Yeah, changes things.
Yeah.
So can I just follow on from that question? When you are selling the kind of the physical component of the code, you're just selling the visual representation of that, not the actual code, presumably?
It varies per artist, and it's really just part of the documentation. So right now, with, let's say, for example, Artblocks is a marketplace that's very popular in the on-chain generative art space. I acquire the work, and I can, right-click, take a look in the background, and I see all the code. It's there. They're also very explicit about what libraries can be used and what libraries can't be used, because it has to be rather small in order for it to be stored on the blockchain. There's a lot of memory involved. In that instance, the code's there, I can see it. But before then, it was sometimes there were artists who would give you the final output. So their final output might be an SVG, a scalable vector file, which is a XML type format. And that's what they were going to give you. They did not feel comfortable giving you the actual code that produced it. There are some artists, Tyler Hobbs, for example, who's in the auction. He'll give you the code. He'll print it out. He'll sign it. This is what produced that. So it's.
But he's not selling the actual code, is he? He's just.
No, it's the visual output.
Yeah,
the visual output is what you get. The code was more part of the documentation. Just to say this produced that. That's it. That's pretty much it.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Scenario happened that the collector then had to go searching for these images and then eventually made an offer to try and buy them back from the thief. At the moment, the software is not there to protect the artist. I think there's a misunderstanding that the blockchain is there to protect the artist, but it isn't. You can take any digital image from most platforms at the moment if the artist isn't protected.
What do you mean by take the image? Oh, you like a right-click save? Oh, no. Say it one more time.
And the image is there as a hybrid image. The artist is trying to sell their images. I just think it's a shame that they're not protected.
So someone taking another artist's artwork and selling it.
Not necessarily another artist, but
Another person. Well, so this is, I think, the most interesting part here is that as a collector, if I do my due diligence and I do my research and I check, you can always verify that that is coming from the legitimate artist. Because also now we have more than ever, accessibility to the artists themselves. It's a quick DM on their email. Hey, I'm really interested in your work. I just wanted to verify this is yours. But for the most part, they are coming from curated platforms. You know, there are a lot of platforms out there that they have to verify that this artist is legitimate. They are a real person. OpenSea is no man's land. You do have to buyer beware, but it's also not as opaque as it used to be, in which someone could create a fraud painting and give it to you, and they have all this fake documentation saying that this is legitimate. Everything is recorded. If you wanted to find the artist and their artwork, it is actually very easy to verify that information. There we go.
So I had a question about the actual code itself. As technology continues to increase and become more complicated, is there a fear that over the next 50 to 70 years that the same code won't be able to still be viewed on a screen? Will the art become obsolete, that there will be a certain point you can't still see it anymore?
Does anybody else? I feel like I've been answering all the questions. Does anyone else want to answer that question?
I think absolutely. I think these things are finite. To go to what you were saying earlier about how, in many ways, when you're kind of working with live code, it's performance-based, and you know, a lot of pieces that I make, you know, have all these dependencies, some of which no longer exist. So work that I made in 2017, some of the dependencies kind of like no longer work, and that can't run live now. But I think that's the case for, you know, a lot of kind of art. You know, it will decay over time, and I think that's okay. I think, you know, these things aren't meant to be kind of perfect snapshots forever. They kind of like reflect kind of the world, and they will kind of decay and disintegrate over time, and I don't have a problem with that.
Sometimes it's equally important to document the piece in a sort of archival sense. So you might want to record it in some way so that you can still see how it looked when it was first made. The V&A, for example, acquired a work by Kyle MacDonald, which is freely available on the web at the moment, but presumably isn't going to stay there forever. But we have a copy of that work. But the museum also has a video recording of it, you know, kind of slice of it, so we can play the video recording. You can see the film of it as it was, rather than as it might end up in 5, 10, 15 years time. So it's just getting a slice of it.
And just to kind of like go back to my earlier analogy of gardening, like I think of sometimes my work like flowers, you know, like you cut them and then they kind of disintegrate over time, or, you know, they decay. And I think there's something quite nice about that, because I think, you know, we were talking about earlier that everyone thinks of digital art, you know, you were saying that, you know, it's this quick thing where you press a button and you get stuff. When in fact, it's this very slow, long, laborious process. And I think that kind of equally kind of like plays a part once it's kind of made. It slowly will kind of like fade over time, and I think it makes it more beautiful because it's finite.
It's like your tulip piece, in fact, isn't it? You know, tulips only survive for a short space of time. You know, they're beautiful for just a few weeks, and then they die, the leaves fall off. So, yeah.
If you're interested in the conservation of time-based media, there's a really wonderful book called Recollection by John Ippolito and Josh Reinhardt. They were curators at the Guggenheim and set up their entire you know, processes for time-based media, which includes digital art. They give a lot of really great references there, so take a look.
Cool. I think I want to thank all our panelists for coming and speaking today, and everyone's welcome to go down to the ground and lower ground floor to view the preview. Enjoy.